Hey friends, I'm Lia Scholl, pastor of First Friends Meeting here in beautiful Greensboro, North Carolina, and I'm so grateful that you've taken some time to be with me today. And today I'm talking about Psalm 50. And last week I mentioned that most of the Psalms are in the voice of the people. They're examples of human feelings and interpretations. And then, of course, we skip right to one who is a speech from God. Are you shaking in your boots yet? Pray with me, please. These words from Psalm 25. Show us your ways, O Lord. Teach us your paths. Lead us in your truth and teach us, for through you we will know wholeness. In Psalm 50, God is addressing their covenant partner concerning matters of a violated covenant. Dun, dun, dun. But before we get to the complaints, there is a theophany. A theophany is a visible manifestation to humanity of God or gods. It's from two Greek words, theos, God, and phanein, to show. The psalmist wants us to understand who God is. The NIV or New Revised Standard Version actually says, the mighty one, God the Lord, speaks and summons the earth from the rising of the sun to its setting. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God shines forth. Our God comes and does not keep silent. Before God is a devouring fire and a mighty tempest all around them. God calls to the heavens above and to the earth that God may judge God's people. Gather me to my faithful ones who made a covenant with me by sacrifice. The heavens declare God's righteousness, for God, God's self, is judge. You no doubt see that God is other than humanity. The psalmist is drawing a picture of a big God. But then in the final verses of that theophany, there's kind of this shift. We move away from the big words of worship to turn our attention to the people. And we switch the language to the language of the Mosaic covenant. Faithful ones, covenant, righteousness, and judge. And judge is probably actually justice in the translation if we were keeping those parallelisms that we talked about last week just right. This turn to the people cues us to the idea that Israel, or us by design, has disappointed God. Van Merrill says it this way: listen, all people, and I shall seek. I will bear witness against you, O nations. As divine presence, eternal flame of love, shall I not find fault with what you call holy? These offerings of greed and war that are before me always, your lies and deceitful ways, your greed for power and wealth are spawned by darkness. I mean, you can't get very far in the Psalms without reading about sin and darkness. Growing up in Protestant evangelical Christianity, you couldn't get away from sin and darkness either. It seems that the theology was rooted in the idea that humans are sinful by nature, made good only through their intellectual assent to a system of beliefs that would save them. I mean, the first step on the Roman road is to accept that you are a sinner. Some call that original sin, believing that eating the fruit from the tree of good and evil meant that somehow all of humanity was broken at best and evil at worst. So I've been wondering how Quakers talk about sin, darkness, and evil, with a particular note of what early Quakers thought about them. Found a good summary piece by Mark Russ about the Quaker faith and practice from Britain that highlighted how their QF&P talks about sin and darkness. As a reminder, the Quaker faith and practice is full of different voices and views, so the theology there may not be totally unified, but there are some general patterns to note. Mark Russ writes this: as for early friends, darkness was almost always spoken of as the opposite of life, and therefore synonymous with sin and evil, everything that was anti-God. George Fox saw the ocean of darkness and death as in opposition to the ocean of God's infinite love. Robert Barclay saw darkness as irreconcilable with light, as Christ is with Antichrist. William Penn equated darkness with death. Job Scott spoke of God defeating the powers of darkness. James Naylor saw the Spirit of God as the antithesis of evil. In 1976, he said that the life and power of God are greater than evil. Many of these same folks talked about the importance of the light when it comes to us seeing the darkness, that the light illuminates the darkness. Thomas Kelly describes God as the revealer of light and darkness, and John Wilhelmina Roundtree speaks of how the crucifixion of Jesus reveals sin, for in it we see the nature of God's relation to sin, of the pain we inflict on God's heart by our own wrongdoing. And in the 20th century, we began to see sin as systemic and institutional evil, as it were. So Quakers do believe in sin, but what is it? The QF&P, according to Mark Russ, names specific evils and sins, and they include personal pride, the vain use of resources and economic inequality, exploitative relationships, torture and slavery, homelessness and unjust landowners, war, armaments, and nuclear weapons. You no doubt notice that there's nothing on that list that one might hear of in an evangelical Protestant church. I have one gay friend who grew up in a Baptist church, and all they railed against was abortion and homosexuality. Every Sunday, one or the other was there in line for the preacher to yell about. We don't believe that those are sins. In large part, we do not believe that those are sins. Sin can be described as a moral failure, and it can be described as a broken relationship with God. But there's an intriguing idea that I stumbled upon while reading, and I'm going to see if I can summarize it here. The first part of it is that George Fox thought that the priests talked too much about sin. He maintained that the light was bigger than the darkness, and that salvation is complete, normal spiritual health and moral power, a life victorious over humanity's darker side. And for George Fox and others, that means that we can live sinless lives. This apparently made the religious folk around Fox very angry. He wrote, "None of them could bear to be told that any should come to Adam's perfection into the image of God. Then they asked me if I had no sin. I answered, Christ, my Savior, has taken away my sin, and in him is no sin." Now, this is from John Hobart in an article comparing Fox and Paul Tillich on sin from Friends Journal in 1957. It seems to me that Fox was intuitively aware that an excessive preoccupation with the problem of personal sin exhibits a basic morbidity and is not the path leading to any saving grace. Rather, does it engender a sort of moral hypochondria, which has the effect of paralyzing the power for good in its victims. The Christian responsibility is not acquitted by avoiding personal sin at all costs. Such an approach is altogether too negative. Evil in one place cannot be overcome by the mere absence of evil in another, as hate can only be overcome by love. So evil must be overcome by a good which carries a positive value. The Christian has, therefore, a creative responsibility. George Fox saw this clearly in his vision of the ocean of light and love overcoming the ocean of darkness. So, what we have is that for Quakers, sin exists. It can be personal and corporate, but it's not inevitable. And the light overcomes the darkness. And that if we look to that light, instead of focusing on sin, the light will grow. And perhaps the converse is true. If we focus on the sin, it will grow instead. As John Hobart wrote, there is much wickedness in the world we do not doubt, but there is also much good. Now, I've already talked a lot about sin without saying how much or whether even this matters today. Ultimately, for me, any discussion about sin leads us back to that theophany at the beginning, a reminder that God is other than us and that God does have expectations for the way we treat our neighbors, friends, enemies, foreigners, and even ourselves. And that expectation is that we hold them with the same covenantal love that God offers us. Maybe a better way of saying that is grace. And so may God grant you grace today. As we enter into a time of waiting worship, I'm going to offer a query from the Quaker Faith and Practice offered by the yearly meeting of the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers in Britain. Take heed, dear friends, to the promptings of love and truth in your hearts. Trust them as the leadings of God, whose light shows our darkness and brings us to a new life. Thanks for being with me. I love you and I love being your pastor.